In this DVD, I demonstrate effective ground fighting techniques. I will show you sweeps, submissions, transitions, how to get back to your feet, and how to utilize effective ground and pound. A lot of these techniques are interconnected. For example, I will show you how to use ground and pound to force your opponent to open his guard, which in turn allows you to either stand back up or use a technique to pass his guard. If you pick and choose which portion to study, it will hinder you in a fight. For the best results, I suggest studying and practicing each technique I have laid out from all the various positions. When you can attack your opponent from all angles and with all sorts of striking and grappling techniques, you not only overwhelm him and keep him on the defense, but you also score points in the judge's eyes. The one thing you never want to do is stall when on the ground. You always want to be moving and attacking. In addition to showing how to attack from the dominant positions, I also show you how to attack and defend when you're in inferior positions.
Alongamento. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Aí girando o pescoço. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. O alongamento do pescoço é muito importante porque a luta de corpo a corpo exige muito dos músculos do pescoço. Aí puxa o braço. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Atrás. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 2, 3, 4, 5. Aí lateral. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Embaixo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Aí gira o braço. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alonga aqui para trás. Alonga aqui para trás o braço. Aí puxa. Puxa. Aí. 3, 5, ao contrário. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Isso. O ombro é super importante também. Isso. Aí, afasta as pernas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 2, 3, 4, 5. Isso. Aí, estica o joelho. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 de frente. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Esticou. Afastou as pernas. O máximo que pode. Mais. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Aí lateral. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Outro lado. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 na frente. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. E outros pés. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Girar o tornozelo é super importante. Muito importante por causa da chave de pé, chave de braço. Puxa aqui. Joelho também. Chave de joelho. 2, 3. E aí. Aqui levanta. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Isso. Agora bota o braço para trás, máximo que puder, e vem sentando para frente. De novo. De novo. Aí deita para alongar a coluna. Trabalhar a guarda, tem que alongar bastante a coluna. Aí lateral. Do outro lado. Sai borboleta. Aí 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. É assim, para alongar bastante esse músculo. Aí gira para cá. Alonga o músculo. Aí gira para o outro lado. Aí entra o quadril aqui. 1, 2, 3, 4. Aí levanta. 2. Aí.
Now we'll show a technique for when my opponent goes to the ground and I remain standing. This type of situation can happen many ways. You can sweep, throw, or trip your opponent, or he could fall for one reason or another, such as when he kicks. Or you could be in your opponent's guard and simply stand up, leaving him on the mat. Normally, your opponent won't stay in this position for long because here he doesn't have a guard, no defense. I stay at a distance and have various ways to strike my opponent's legs. I can grab the inside of his leg and throw a kick to his thigh, which I often choose to do, or I can grab the outside of his leg and throw a kick. So, once again, I can grab the inside of his leg and kick to the thigh, or I can grab the outside of his leg and kick to the thigh as well. It depends on what feels more natural to you.
Depende como você se sente melhor. Uma velocidade pouco normal.
Or on the inside. Once more. Never dip your head forward because your opponent will kick you in the face. You always want to maintain your posture.
Então a postura sempre aqui. Pedala. Volta. Pedala.
Now I demonstrate how to land a heel kick to your opponent's stomach. This is a good technique because a lot of times he won't be ready for the strike.
No estômago dele, na barriga dele. Muitas das vezes o oponente não espera.
If your opponent's legs are in front of his body, it can be difficult to get around his guard. So I lift my leg, circle it around the outside of his leg, and then drive my leg downward and strike his stomach with my heel.
Fazendo um movimento circular, usando essa região da perna, do pé.
Once more slowly. You want to lift your leg up and then use the weight of your leg and drive your heel downward.
Solta o peso da perna.
Now a little faster.
Pouco mais rápido, fazendo um movimento circular.
When the rules allow, kicking a downed opponent in the face is an excellent technique. It will catch a lot of opponents by surprise because they're expecting you to kick their legs, not their head. So, to prevent your opponent from kicking you in the face, you grab both of his ankles at the same time, spread his legs apart, and then step between his legs and onto his face. Once you've smashed his face, you'll usually end up with one foot between his legs and one above his head. From this position, I like to drop a hammer fist into the side of his head. Once more. Now from a different angle. If my opponent places his feet on my legs, as long as the rules permit, I like to grab his legs, open them, and then stomp his face. Now faster. Now I demonstrate how to land a flying punch on a downed opponent. Because you're jumping over the top of your opponent's legs, it can be difficult for him to defend against the technique. If his legs are up, I will either support myself on his knee or on his stomach as I go over. Both work. I will first do it slow. Now a little faster. I can land either in or out of my opponent's guard. Either way works. Obviously, passing his guard leaves you in a more dominant position. Slow movement. Now a little faster. Once more slowly. I can support myself on his knee or on his stomach. Now I will show you a technique for passing the guard of a downed opponent. If I feel I am better on the ground than my opponent, I might use this technique to pass his guard rather than use one of the previous striking techniques. I have my base here, and my opponent wants to pull me into his guard as I go down. So, as I go down, I grab his ankle and force his leg between my legs. If I can pass over his leg, then I reach side control. But if your opponent is game, most of the time you will not be able to immediately pass his guard. In such a case, I will push on his knee here, and then pass my far leg over his leg and reach side control.
Ele vai querer me colocar na guarda. Eu dropo e entro aqui, fechando esse gancho.
Once in side control, I switch the positioning of my knees to secure a sturdy base. One more time. My opponent wants to put me in his guard as I go down. So I force his leg between my legs, enter, and push on his knee. Next, I straighten my far leg, step over his leg, and reach side control. Once in side control, I switch the positioning of my knees. One more time. I am in the standing position, and my opponent wants to pull me into his guard as I come down. I go to his guard, but I drive his leg between my legs. Pushing on his knee, I extend my far leg, step over his leg, and reach side control. I go to the guard, and then I pass into side control. Now I demonstrate how to attack your opponent's leg from the standing position. If you don't do everything perfect, there is a chance that your opponent will escape and assume the top position, so normally I will use this technique in the last seconds of a round because there is less risk. To execute the technique, I'll grab my opponent's leg and secure it in my armpit. Next, I drive my left knee between my opponent's legs. Before I attempt to finish the submission, I place my right foot on my opponent's stomach to prevent him from coming up. If you allow your opponent to come up, he will escape the submission and possibly obtain a dominant position. Once you drop back, it is possible to finish the submission without turning, but normally I will rotate my upper body and turn my head to put more pressure on my opponent's leg. If you have this submission locked tight, your opponent will tap. Once more. The same submission. Now I will spar with my brother using the techniques I just showed. Now we'll demonstrate ground and pound techniques when you're in your opponent's closed guard, which is when you're between his legs and he locks his feet together behind your back. A lot of times when you're in this position, your opponent will latch onto your hands to prevent you from striking. You have many options for breaking his grips. You can bend your arm to strip his hand away, grab his hand with your opposite hand to prevent him from re-grabbing, and then strike. You can also latch onto his hand and strip his grip away. There are millions of ways. Escape and then hit. But with each technique, you want to keep your opponent's back pinned to the mat to prevent him from sitting up into you. If he sits up, it'll be a lot harder to strike him. You can see if your opponent comes up, it becomes difficult to strike him. To prevent this from happening, I always put my hands on my opponent and press down into him to keep his back pinned. You always want to secure your opponent so he doesn't come up. Even though positioning your arms in this fashion allows your opponent to set up a sweep, he can just as easily sweep you if you allow him to come up. So the most important part is to keep your opponent pinned to the floor. Control his arms and then hit. If he secures your hand or wrist, pull out, grab his hand, and then hit. It is also important to note here that if you use your left hand to keep your opponent's back pinned to the mat, you want to elevate your right knee. This offers you an even better angle to punch your opponent with your right hand. It also increases the power behind your strike. From here, I have a great angle to punch my opponent. I can put my entire body into the punch. Even when you are unable to break your opponent's grips on your wrist, you still have an option to strike him. By rotating your arm above the arm your opponent is using to grab, you can land a nice elbow to his face. It is an excellent way to strike him even when he has your arms under control. When you manage to break your opponent's grip on your arm and then secure his arm to his chest, you can also throw an elbow strike to his thigh. You can go high to his face or you can go low to his thigh. Just like it is when you are standing, going low is a good tactic for setting up a high strike. So here I elbow my opponent's thigh and then I go to his head with the punch. So there are many ways you can use punches and elbow strikes when in your opponent's guard, such as lifting a leg and striking over the top. If your opponent secures your hand, you can break his grip with elbow movement, grab his hand to prevent him from re-grabbing, and then throw a punch. Or you can grab his hand, strip away his grip, and then punch. You can also throw your elbow over the top, putting your whole body into the strike. You can also elbow your opponent's thigh to set up a punch to his head. Remember, hitting low will draw your opponent's focus low, allowing you to go high with your next strike. The thigh, the head. If you're holding your opponent down with your left hand, lifting your right knee will provide a better angle for striking with your right hand. It allows you to drop all of your weight down with the punch. Now I spar with my brother using the ground and pound techniques I just demonstrated. Now I'll demonstrate how to stand up and open your opponent's closed guard. You do not want to keep your arms extended as you stand up because it gives your opponent an opportunity to attack. Instead, you want to control his arms while you stand up. As you come up, you want to put your knees under his legs and then punch him. Notice how when I hit my opponent, he automatically opens his guard for defense. When this happens, I will drive one of my knees between my opponent's legs. He will want to sit up here. To prevent him from making anything happen, I pummel my right arm underneath his left arm. At the same time, I use my opposite hand to push his right leg to the mat. Next, I drop my right knee on top of his right leg to keep it pinned to the mat. This allows me to pass over his leg and into side control. One more time. If it is difficult to open my opponent's guard, then I will begin to hit him. I stand up now. He opens his guard, and I sit with my knee between his legs. Now I begin to pass into side control. I have passed into side control. One more time from another angle. I have various ways to set up this technique. I can control my opponent's arms, or I can begin punching him. Either way, I stand up and continue to hit my opponent. He opens his guard, and I push my knee up the middle. The instant he sits up into me, I pummel my arm underneath his arm and use my opposite hand to force his right leg to the mat. Next, I place my right leg over his leg to keep it pinned. Once accomplished, I can pass my left leg over his right leg and move into side control. One more time from another angle. I have various ways to set up this technique. I can control my opponent's arms, or I can begin punching him. I am always using my arms to keep my opponent's back pinned to the mat. I begin to hit him, I stand up, I hit him, he opens his guard, and I drive my knee up the middle. He sits up to pummel, and I beat him to the punch by pummeling my right arm underneath his left arm. With my opposite hand, I push his leg to the mat, place my knee over his leg, and then pass into side control. Here's another way to pass your opponent's guard. To begin, I overwhelm my opponent with punches and elbow strikes to get him to open his guard. The instant he unhooks his legs, he places his knees in front of his body to maintain distance and hinder my strikes. When this occurs, I pummel both my arms underneath his legs and put my head down. If you leave your head up, you will get punched, so keep your head down. Additionally, if I leave space between my head and my shoulders, he will have the opportunity to counter my pass with a submission of his own. From here, I drive forward, force his legs to the side, and pass. One more time, he opens his guard to defend. I pummel my arms underneath his legs, and then I drive his legs forward and to the side, allowing me to pass into side control. Now from another angle. I overwhelm my opponent with strikes. He opens his guard and brings his knees to my chest to defend. I pummel my arms underneath his legs and lower my head. Notice how I reach my right hand to the right side of his neck, then turn and force my opponent's legs to the side. By forcing your opponent's legs toward his head, it eliminates his control and makes passing much easier. Hitting, enter here and pass.
Ele abriu a guarda, eu vou meter as duas mãos.
I am hitting him, and he opens his guard. I enter with both of my hands.
Tirou, tirou.
Now I show ground and pound techniques that you can use when in your opponent's half guard. Just as the name implies, half guard is half of your opponent's defense, making it easier to hit him than when you're in his full guard. It's an even easier position to strike from than north-south. For example, if my opponent secures my hand, I can attack with my opposite hand. I can also secure his hand and attack with my opposite hand. There are a lot of options from half guard. When possible, you can also attack with both hands. Another scenario is when you have one of your opponent's arms secured to keep him on his back, and he uses his free arm to secure your free arm. Even in such a situation, you can attack with an elbow strike. So, elbow from top to bottom. Just as when in the guard, you can target your opponent's thigh with elbow strikes. Again, by striking your opponent's leg, you pull his focus low, creating an opening to go high with the punch. Once you go high, to switch things up, you strike with your opposite hand. You can even use faking techniques. For example, you place one hand on your opponent's mouth and then strike his thigh with your opposite elbow. If you've already gone low and then high several times, your opponent will expect you to strike him with the same arm you elbowed him with. As he goes to defend, you drop an elbow strike to his face using your lead arm instead. It is important to keep your opponent's back pinned to the mat. Sometimes this can be difficult because he wants to get to his side. If he gets to his side, he will have a lot of options. So to prevent this, place your hand on his chest and hold him down. Here's another way to keep your opponent pinned. I drop my body low, slide my left arm across his neck, and apply downward pressure. Once I have him pinned in this position, I can hit him. You always need to be alert, looking for opportunities to strike. I can throw a punch, I can elbow. If I give him too much space, he can slide his knee underneath me and re-establish the full guard. Sometimes it requires some space to ground and pound, but if you feel your opponent move to his side, pin his back to the mat again and then continue to hit him. Again, a lot of striking opportunities. For example, strike his thigh and then come over the top. Elbow strikes work great from the half guard. First control your opponent and then hit him. Throw repeated strikes over and over. Control his arm, elbow over the top, elbow to the thigh, throw to the top, elbow top to bottom, always changing your angle. Throw to the bottom and then to the top. Notice how my hips are nearly perpendicular to Shinzo's hips. This kills his bottom leg, reducing its effectiveness. The further I let him circle to my right, the more effective his legs will be in half guard. So make sure to control his upper body with your free arm while striking from half guard. Now I spar with my brother Shinzo using the half guard ground and pound techniques I just demonstrated. Now I demonstrate the figure 4 armbar. First off, I change my base so that my back is facing my opponent's head. Next, I will pretend as though I'm going to pass his half guard. I accomplish this by placing my hand on my opponent's knee and pressing outward. Thinking I am trying to separate his legs and pull my trap leg free, he reaches his left arm up to defend. The instant he does this, I establish a figure 4 lock on his arm and apply the submission. So, I grab his left wrist with my right hand, slide my left arm under his left elbow, and then grab my right wrist with my left hand. So, one more time. I change my base, fake the pass, and secure his arm. I can finalize here, or I can turn his hand and finish here. One more time. I turn and secure my base as best as possible. I place my hand on his knee and pretend to separate his legs to pull my trap leg free. As he goes to defend, I secure his arm. I hook my left arm underneath his left elbow and grab his left wrist with my right hand. I can finish the submission here, or I can turn and finish him here. This position is much more powerful than the previous arm position. My arm under his elbow acts as the fulcrum, and his thumb is facing away from that fulcrum. This allows my entire upper body to put leverage directly against his elbow joint, causing it to hyperextend. It is important to mention that I place my weight on his chest. If I lean too far over to the side, he can sweep me over to my back and obtain a dominant position. If I am too low on the opposite side, then I don't have the leverage needed to finish the submission. So I place my center of gravity in the center of his body. I fake the pass, he defends, and then I secure the submission. Now I demonstrate the katagatame submission from half guard, a technique I use to finish Sakaju in the UFC. To set up the submission, I secure my opponent's forearm with one hand and then hit him with my opposite arm. Even if he secures my wrist, I can come over the top and hit him with my elbow. When I hit him with the elbow, he defends against my attack by raising his elbows. This is the reaction that I wanted. The instant his elbow goes up, I slide my right arm under his head and place my head against the right side of his elevated arm. Next, I will pass into side control. I accomplish this by placing my left foot on top of his knee and then forcing his knee downward. This allows me to pull my trap leg free and move into side control. Once there, I finish the submission by placing my knee in his stomach, driving my chin into his eye, and squeezing my arms tight. Sometimes you need to play around with the finish to discover what works best for you. One more time. I am hitting my opponent. He elevates his elbow to protect himself, and I secure his head. I place my left foot on top of his leg and pull my right leg out. Sometimes when I'm holding my opponent down in the half guard, he wants to push me. To set up the submission, I will strike his arm through, place my head on the side of his arm to trap it to the side of his neck, pass to side control in the opposite direction, stabilize the position, and finish the submission. Once more, I am in the half guard position, my opponent pushes his arm into me, and I strike his arm over and push my body forward, driving my head toward the floor. Notice how I post out wide with my right arm. Unlike in the previous katagatame variation, now my head is across Shinzo's body. Because my weight is far across his center line, and his legs are blocking my right foot as a point of base, my right hand will be the only thing stopping my brother from executing a sweep in the middle of my transition. Here I show the submission again. I hit, hit, hit. When my opponent defends, I enter. I place my foot on top of his leg, I pull it, free my trapped leg, move to the side control position. Here is the second version. I am in side control, my opponent pushes into me with his arm, I hit it to the side, push my head forward, place my foot on his leg, pass into side control, and finish the submission. One more time. I strike my opponent from the half guard, he defends, I slide my arm under his head. Next, I place my foot on top of his leg, pass, and finish the submission. Now I demonstrate to the opposite side. I'm holding my opponent down, he pushes into me with his arm. Drop my head down, pass, finish. Now I demonstrate how to submit your opponent with a leg lock from the half guard. With my back turned toward my opponent's head, I wrap my right arm underneath his far leg and pull it toward my body. You don't want to let him pull his leg toward the mat. You want to keep it tight to your body. Next, I place my left hand on the mat, post, and move my left knee over his body. This puts me in a perfect position to apply the leg lock. I hook the leg, place my hand on the mat, and step my knee over his body. From here you can see the space I need to slide across his body. I make that space by posting up on my hand, driving my leg across his torso, and pinching my knees together. In this position, you can see how my knees and hips are both at a 90-degree angle. This body position allows me to apply much more forward pressure with my hips than if my legs and hips were straight. When I pin his foot to my chest, my hips become the fulcrum, applying pressure and hyperextending the knee joint. Then I finish the submission. I hook the leg, place my hand on the mat, and step my knee over his body. Now I will demonstrate a leg lock that is not very traditional, but highly effective nonetheless. Normally when you're in the half guard, your opponent will expect you to move your body in a clockwise direction and apply the leg lock I demonstrated in the previous technique. He is waiting to defend against it. To switch things up, I repeatedly strike my opponent in the face. With him distracted, I rotate in a counterclockwise direction, step my left leg over his legs, and then apply the leg lock. One more time. I am hitting my opponent. When he is distracted, I rotate in a counterclockwise direction, step over his legs, and apply the submission. I am hitting my opponent. When he is distracted, I rotate in a counterclockwise direction, step over his legs, and apply the submission. Once more, fast. I am hitting my opponent, rotate, and lock in the submission. Now I demonstrate how to catch your opponent in an arm lock when he attempts to submit you with a Kimura from his half guard. So my opponent attacks me with a Kimura. My first defense is to place the arm he is attacking between my legs. This takes away his leverage, making it difficult for him to lock in his hold. If I leave my arm to the outside, he can elevate it and apply the submission. Next, I need to escape my left knee from between my opponent's legs, so I come up onto my foot and wiggle my knee free. Once accomplished, I step my right foot over my opponent's head and secure his arm. From here, I can finish the submission while my leg is still trapped between my opponent's legs, or I can use my free foot to free my trapped leg.
novamente tentar tirar a perna, me ajeitar e atacar.
Again, my opponent secures the Kimura, and I place my arm between my legs to eliminate his leverage. I straighten my trap leg, step my free leg over his head, and attack his arm. I can finish with my leg still trapped, or I can free my leg and then finish. Once more, I am working to pass my opponent's guard, and he surprises me by locking in a Kimura. I place my trapped hand between my legs, free my knee, step over his head, sit, and attack his arm. Again, there are two ways to finish. You can apply the submission with your leg still trapped, or you can free your leg first.
Tira essa perna de dentro. Mais uma vez, pouquinho mais rápido.
Notice how I'm keeping my right shoulder low and tight to his chest here. This prevents my opponent from gaining the leverage he needs to finish the submission should he manage to strip my arm free from under my leg. So, he attacks with the Kimura, I defend, pull my knee out, and go for the arm lock. Now I show a simple guard pass that is used quite frequently in MMA. From the half guard, I place my free foot on top of my opponent's near leg and press down. At the same time, I move my head to the left side of my opponent's head to maintain my balance. Placing my head on the mat, I drive my weight forward, force his leg toward the mat with my free foot, pull my trap leg free, and move into side control. Like I said before, I establish a hook on my opponent's leg with my free foot, move my head to the opposite side, drive forward, and move into side control. A little faster. Once more. I establish my hook, change my head, and pass. This can be a very safe guard pass in MMA if done correctly, and it can be very effective as your opponent grows more tired and sweaty as the fight wears on. But it is critical that you switch your head to the inside of your opponent's head on this pass. Otherwise, your weight will be distributed far across your opponent's center line, allowing him to easily sweep you as your center of gravity rises while executing this technique. Now I spar with my brother using the half guard techniques I just demonstrated. Now we'll demonstrate some ground and pound techniques from the 100 kilos or side control position. When in side control, it is very important to establish a solid base and to constantly apply downward pressure on your opponent. Once accomplished, you have many options to strike. You can elbow your opponent in the face. You can drop hammer fist to the side of his face. You can trap his near arm between your legs, which prevents him from defending against your strikes. You can also turn into him and place your knee against the side of his head, opening up even more options to strike him. From this position, you can drive elbows into the opposite side of his head. You also have the opportunity to pull your opponent towards you and place your knee on his stomach. From the knee on belly position, You can drive in elbow strikes and hammer fists.
Aqui eu tenho o cotovelo. Batida. Mostrando mais
Now a
uma
little
vez a posição
faster.
que eu me encontro, pouquinho mais de velocidade. Estou aqui.
You can drive in elbow strikes, trap your opponent's arm between your legs and strike both sides of his head.
Bater nele aqui, bater nele nessa posição.
You can turn into your opponent, pin his back to the mat, and strike him.
Tá?
You can also turn into your opponent, drive in elbow strikes to the side of his head. Then you can pull your opponent into you and establish the knee on belly position and strike from there. From the side, elbow and punch. Trap his arm and strike. Turn to the side, elbow. Pull him into you, establish the knee on belly position. Land more elbows. Now I spar with my brother from side control using the ground and pound techniques I just demonstrated. Now I demonstrate how to lock in the Kimura submission from side control. To start, I pull my opponent toward me using my right hand and move my left knee over his head. Notice how this forces his right arm across his body, isolating it. Assuming this position immobilizes your opponent. To finish the submission, I assume a figure 4 grip on my opponent's right arm and apply pressure. One more time. I hook my right hand underneath my opponent's left arm and pull him toward me. Next, I move my left knee over his head and place it on the mat. To apply the submission, I pull his right arm toward me, establish the figure 4 grip, and finish. By stepping over my opponent's head, I'm taking away his ability to sit up. If I allow him to sit up, it will greatly reduce the amount of pressure I can apply to his shoulder. Now I show a technique for transitioning from side control into the mount position. When you want to make this transition, it might feel natural to simply step your leg over your opponent's body, but a lot of times he will trap your leg as you bring it over, putting you in his half guard. To prevent this from happening, I'll place my knee on my opponent's stomach instead. Next, I'll walk my far hand forward, forcing my opponent's left arm toward his head. This action provides the room I need to slide my knee over my opponent's stomach and drop it down to the opposite side of his body. One more time. I'm in side control. I place my knee on my opponent's stomach, walk my far arm forward to force his arm up to his head, and establish the mount. From side control, place your knee on the stomach, walk your hand up, establish the mount. One more time. Now I will spar with my brother from side control using the techniques I demonstrated. The first thing you want to do when you reach the mount position is establish control. If you fail to control your opponent, you will lose the position. So you want to mount a little low on your opponent's body and spread out. You can lock your legs underneath your opponent's legs or not. It depends upon what you feel is most comfortable. Just make sure you have a solid base and you're spread out. When your opponent begins to buck and thrash to escape the position, you want to support yourself with your hands. This is very important. And your legs are always supporting you, helping you maintain the position. If you don't have the proper positioning with your legs, he can push your hips. If your opponent pushes your hips in an attempt to strip you off the mount, lower your hips and keep your legs hooked underneath his legs. If you don't do it correctly, he will be able to elevate your hips and potentially escape. So I brace myself as he tries to buck me to one side or the other. When he attempts to push me off of him, I lower my hips and lift his legs using my legs. Once you stabilize the position, you have various options. As long as you remain nice and tight, you can move up his body a little bit. Then I place my hand on his throat to keep his head pinned to the mat as I posture up. If you posture up without placing a hand on your opponent's neck, then he can move his head from side to side and avoid your strikes. When you have a hand pressing down into his throat, you can land clean strikes. You can elbow, punch, 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 elbow. Instead of trying to escape the position, your opponent will focus on trying to protect himself. When this occurs, you can continue to strike or set up an arm lock. So, from the mount, I will hit my opponent to set up the arm lock. When he elevates his arms to protect himself, I will scoot my body even higher on his body. Then, I will slide my foot up by his head. It is important to remain nice and tight and sit your weight on your opponent's chest to prevent him from moving. With my opponent pinned, I hook my right arm around his left arm and sit back. From there, I move my right leg over his head, pull on his arm, and finish the submission. One more time. I mount and stabilize the position. He moves, and I brace myself with my arms. Other side. I begin by stabilizing the mount. One more time on the other side.
Quadril baixo. Levanta, levanta. Levanta.
I stabilize the mount, keeping my hips low. Now I spar with my brother from the mount position. Here I demonstrate how to establish the back position when your opponent is on all fours. While on my opponent's side, he keeps his elbows tucked tightly to his legs to prevent me from obtaining control of his body. To create an opening, I strike him in the head. To prevent himself from taking damage, he elevates his right elbow up to his head. The instant he does this, he creates space between his elbow and leg. That's when I step my right foot into the gap and establish my first hook. Wrapping my right leg around the inside of his right leg, I slide my right arm around the right side of his neck and underneath his body. The instant I land on my back, I establish my second hook by wrapping my left leg over the top of his left leg. Now I have excellent control over my opponent and can begin working for a submission. Once more, kneeling on the side of my opponent with one arm wrapped over his body, I begin striking him in the head. When he lifts his right elbow to defend my shots, I establish my first hook with my right leg. Wrapping up his upper body, I pull him on top of me. My opponent is on all fours, and I'm on his side, controlling him with one arm wrapped over his back. I hit him to create an opening, step my foot into the gap, hug his body, and pull him on top of me. Notice how I establish an underhook on the arm opposite to the side of my leg hook. This will keep him from rolling face to face with me during the brief transition to my back. Now I show how to apply a rear naked choke when you take your opponent's back. First off, it is very important that you establish both of your hooks using your legs. This prevents your opponent from turning into you and landing in your guard. Sometimes it helps to use the strength of your legs to spread your opponent's legs. If you can do this, it will be even more difficult for him to turn his body. However, you never want to cross your feet because it allows your opponent to apply a leg lock. You want to keep your legs parallel to one another. When you accomplish this, you want to establish over-under control. To do this, wrap one arm over his shoulder and your other arm underneath his arm. With the arm that's not wrapped around your opponent's neck, use it to control his arm. Then, pull your opponent down on top of you. You don't want the arm that's over your opponent's shoulder to be loose. You want to wrap it tight around his neck, reaching toward your opposite shoulder. Once you reach this position, let go of your opponent's arm, bring your arm up, and lock in the hold. The choke will work when you place your hand on top of your opponent's head, but it works even better when you can get your hand underneath your opponent's head. Really lock the choke tight. Notice here my palm of my left hand is facing me during the choke, not the back of Shinzo's head. This can sometimes be hard to accomplish in an MMA fight with the extra bulk of the gloves, but it does make for a tighter strangle. To force your opponent to tap, all you have to do is squeeze everything tight. Once again, you never want to cross your legs. If you forget and cross them by mistake, your opponent will most likely apply a quick leg lock. So always keep your legs open, use them to spread your opponent's legs. Then, pull him down on top of you and secure the choke. If your opponent defends against the choke using his arm, change sides. If he attempts to prevent the choke by tucking his chin, drive a hand underneath his nose, lift his chin up, and then apply the choke. So, close the gap and he will tap. Once more, I bring my opponent onto me. Now I demonstrate how to submit your opponent with an armbar from the back position. Just as I did before, I pull my opponent onto me. In order for this submission to work, you want your opponent's body lying on top of you. If he falls to his side, then your leg will be trapped to the mat, making it impossible to move your leg around his head. So, you always want to keep your leg free when executing this submission. If you are doing this submission to the opposite side, then you want to keep your opposite leg free. If he rolls to that side, then your leg will be trapped. As long as you keep that leg free, you can throw it over his head and finish the armbar. So I have pulled my opponent on top of me. I attempt to finish him with the rear naked choke, but he defends against the submission. So I switch to the armbar.
Então, eu tô aqui. Agora, se ele prender para cá, eu posso continuar. E vou atacar o braço aqui. Mais uma vez, mostrando.
One more time. I attack my opponent's neck with the choke. He defends, so I release the arm I have wrapped around his neck, Move it to the opposite side of his head and grab his wrist.
Mais uma vez.
Notice how once I grab his left wrist with my right hand, I grab my right wrist with my left hand. This is a figure 4 grip, and it allows you to maintain control of your opponent's arm while you throw your leg over his head.
Volta. Um pouquinho mais rápido.
Now I demonstrate how to submit your opponent with katagatame from the back position when he is defending against the rear naked choke. Having secured an underhook with my right arm and an overhook with my left arm, I pull my opponent onto me. With his hands tied up defending the rear naked choke, I hook my left leg underneath his left leg and apply pressure to remove his post. This redistributes his weight, which will make it easier for me to slip out from underneath him. Next, I slide my right arm across his neck, drop my left elbow down to the mat, and establish a 10-finger grip. It is important that I tuck my left elbow to my side in order not to hinder my roll. Once accomplished, I force my opponent to my left and roll onto my left side. Notice how I have his right arm trapped between my head and right arm. To defend against the submission, my opponent attempts to turn back into me. If I allow him to do this, he could possibly escape. So I place my right foot in the crook of his left leg, which allows me to prevent him from posting on that foot and rolling into me. Next, I move off to my opponent's side and come up onto my knees. To finish the submission, I drive his right shoulder into the side of his neck by pressing my head against his triceps, and my arms cut into the left side of his neck, severing the blood flow to his brain. He has no choice but to tap out. Now I will spar with my brother from the back position, using the techniques I demonstrated in real speed. Now I will focus on the bottom guard position. When you're lying on your back with an opponent in your guard, you must be very alert. If you have your guard closed, meaning your feet are locked together behind your opponent's back, then you'll be very easy to hit. So most of the time you don't want to stay in closed guard for long. The tendency is to open your guard and place your feet on your opponent's hips. You can have your opponent's arms between your legs or on the outside of your legs. For defense, the most important thing is that your feet on your opponent's hips. If I'm in the closed guard and my opponent punches, I lift my arm to defend against the strike. At the same time, I open my guard and place my left foot on his hip. If my opponent is really big, then I'll place my knee in his chest to further hinder his striking. Notice how when I place my knees on my opponent's chest, I am further away from him, making it harder for him to reach my face with his punches. Now if my opponent removes my leg from his chest, forces it to the mat, and then throws a punch, I will elevate my arm and utilize an outside block. But first, you should always use your legs for defense. Once more, my opponent begins attacking me, and I use my legs for defense. Again, my opponent attacks me, and I use my legs for defense, always protecting myself. Now I demonstrate what to do when your opponent decides to stand up in your guard. Every time he stands up, you need to control his hands.
Nessa situação aqui, eu vou colocar os dois pés na virilha ao mesmo tempo.
In this situation, I place both of my feet on his hips at the same time, and as he stands up, I use my legs to push his body away from me.
Se ele ficar aí, eu vou fazer isso aqui. Aí empurrei.
If he comes back toward me, then I will kick his knee, move onto my side, and plant my elbow on the mat.
Essa mão sempre alta.
To protect my head from kicks, I always keep my opposite hand elevated.
Vou bater
Next,
no joelho
I will
dele.
kick his knee and then come up onto my hand. I will kick his knee one last time and pop back up to the standing position. The opposite points of base on my body are what allow me to swing my hips underneath me effortlessly and assume a standing position while facing my opponent throughout the entire transition. So here, my left foot and right hand. When you have an opponent in your guard, a lot of times you will place his hands on your chest or hook them around the back of your head. In such a situation, I'll wrap my arms over his arms to control them. There are many ways to secure the arms, and it's up to you to discover what feels best. Once I'm controlling his arms, I'll dig my free hand underneath his knee. While still controlling his arms, I will use my hook on his knee to turn my body toward my right side. At the same time, I elevate my right leg over his back and swing my left leg over his head.
Levantando essa perna e essa perna passa direto.
One more time. My opponent grabs my head and I establish control over his arms. Next, I dig my hand under his knee, turn toward my right side, and pass my leg over his head. Then I finish the armbar. My opponent grabs my head and I obtain control of his arm. Next, I slide my hand under his knee, rotate my body, and then throw my leg over his head. When you throw your leg over your opponent's head, it is very important that you do so immediately. You don't want to move your foot up to your opponent's hip and then throw it over his head. You want to move it all the way over his head immediately. One more time. This is a quick move made possible by a mistake from your opponent. If you hesitate on the transition, you will likely lose the submission. In this technique, I attempt to submit my opponent with the armbar, but he pulls his arm free, preventing me from getting the submission. Instead of giving up on my positioning, I immediately switch to an omoplata, which is a shoulder lock. So here my opponent is in my guard and he grabs my head, just like in the last sequence. I control his arms, dig my hand under his knee, rotate, and throw my leg over his head. However, when I bring my leg over, my opponent pulls his arm out, making it impossible for me to finish the armbar. Instead of giving up, I attack his other arm, which is still inside. To do this, I kick my legs forward, cross my legs to lock his arm, and come up. Notice how I throw my right arm over his back. This will prevent him from rolling. One more time. My opponent holds my head, I control his arm, pass my leg over his head. He gets his arm out, and I go for the omoplata by locking up his arm, kicking forward, and coming up. He grabs, I control his arm, throw my leg over. He pulls his arm free, and I go for the omoplata. Kick my legs to get him to come forward, sit up, and force him to tap. There are many ways to apply a triangle choke on an opponent in your guard. The method I show here is perhaps the most basic. So I grab my opponent's wrist to control his arms. When you do this in a fight, your opponent will want to posture up to break your grips. If he pulls his right arm away to break my grip, then I will force his right arm down between his legs. So again, if he pulls his right arm away from my body, I will force his right arm down between his legs. Next, you want to go for the triangle, but you don't want to spread your legs wide. You want to slide them past your opponent's shoulders, keep everything tight. My left leg goes over his right shoulder and across the back of his neck. Then, I throw my right leg over my left leg. To finish the submission, I squeeze my legs tight. Notice my knees squeezing together. This decreases the space inside of the triangle, making the strangle stronger. One more time. I push his arm down, wrap my left leg around the right side of his neck, throw my left leg over my right shin, and secure the position. To help apply the triangle, I reach my right hand up, grab my shin, and pull my leg down. Notice how this breaks his posture. Also notice how I have moved his right arm toward my left side. This is key for finishing the submission. To lock everything tight, I pull his head down with my hands and squeeze my legs tight. One more time. I grab his hands, he tries to break my grips, and as he does this, I pass my leg over. To help secure the triangle, I grab my shin and pull my leg down. Next, I pull his head down with my hands and squeeze my legs tight. Now I demonstrate how to apply a kimura on an opponent in your guard. First, I grab my opponent's wrist to control his arm. Next, I reach my opposite arm across his body, sit up, hook my right arm around his right arm, and then secure the kimura position by grabbing my left wrist with my right hand. In order to finish the submission, you must escape your hips off to the side. If your opponent has his head in the center of your body, then it can prevent you from sitting up. In such a situation, I will push my opponent's head off to the side as I obtain control of his arm. From there, you finish the submission the same. Notice I'm keeping his elbow bent at 90 degrees. This allows me to put a maximum pressure on the shoulder joint while at the same time minimizing his escape options. Now I demonstrate a technique for sweeping your opponent to his back when he's in your guard. I like this sweep a lot because it often catches your opponent by surprise. To set it up, I will lock in a kimura on my opponent's arm and then use my positioning to execute the sweep. If my opponent defends against the sweep, then I will put my focus into finishing him with the kimura. However, my first approach is to use the hold on his arm for the sweep. So I push on my opponent's head and attack with the kimura. You can place your left foot on your opponent's hip, or you can place it lower on his knee, whichever you feel is more comfortable. By locking in the kimura, your opponent will focus on protecting his arm. While he's preoccupied, you make some space and then strike his leg with your leg. You don't want to strike his leg directly from the side, but rather from the side and downward. When successful, it takes you right to the mount. With your opponent worried about you locking in the kimura, he forgets about his leg in the sweep. I go for his arm and hip out a little bit as I dominate his arm. As he defends against the kimura, I kick, sweep him, and end up in the mount. I push on my opponent's head and dominate his arm. Notice how as I attack his arm, I scoot my hips out to my right side. When I do this, my left leg gets closer to my opponent's right leg. Next, I execute the sweep and claim the mount position.
Mais uma vez, tire a cabeça dele, vou me ajeitando, coloco esse pé aqui, ele está defendendo o braço,
Now I spar with my brother from the guard position, using the techniques I just demonstrated. Now I show a very basic sweep, one that is taught to jiu-jitsu white belts. Although it's quite simple, it's highly effective. To begin, I place my feet on my opponent's hips, which is a defensive position. Next, I slide my left foot between my opponent's legs, hook my right foot around the inside of his left leg, drive my left arm underneath his right arm, and sit up. I do not keep my hips square with my opponent's hips. When I sit up, I turn to my side. I grab his left arm with my right hand and then pull his arm into me and secure it underneath my arm. My left arm is hooked underneath his right arm and is wrapped tightly around his back. With everything secure, I fall to my right side, elevate my left leg into his right leg, and sweep him over. Because I have control of his left arm, he can't place his left hand on the mat to block the sweep. One more time. I sit up into my opponent, establish an underhook with my left arm, grab his right arm, hip out to my left side, and sweep. It is important to notice the positioning of my right leg. You can hook it around the inside of your opponent's left leg, or you can place your foot on his left knee. You can even place it to the outside of your opponent's left leg. All the positions work. It boils down to what you find works best. I am in the guard, establish an underhook, sit up, dominate his arm, and execute the sweep. One more time. I dominate his arm, and then sweep. When you're in the half guard, it is very important that you establish an underhook and get up to your side. If you're flat on your back, your opponent has total control. So, once I dig my right arm under my opponent's left arm and establish an underhook, I grab his far side to maintain the position. Next, I pull my left leg out from between my opponent's legs. To get the sweep, I hook my left arm around his far leg, pull his leg into me, and drive into him to put him on his back. It is a very simple sweep, but highly effective. As I mentioned, it is very important to establish the underhook. If my opponent is postured up, then I dig my right arm under his left arm and drive into him. If you establish the underhook and don't move into your opponent, he can establish an overhook on your arm and then use his position to punch you in the face. So you want to get very close to your opponent to prevent him from striking you. It destroys his angle to strike. Now I come to all fours, block the knee, and drive. Now fast. To create space, I drive my right arm into my opponent's throat and force him away. With his body pushed away from my body, it is much easier to pummel my right arm underneath his left arm and establish an underhook. Next, I move my body into him to prevent him from having a strong angle to strike me. So I'm in the half guard and I enter like this. In this situation, your opponent has passed your guard and moved into the 100 kilos or side control position. First off, I place my right forearm into my opponent's throat and apply upward pressure. If I wrap my right arm around the back of his head, it makes it easier for my opponent to make offensive movements. So I place my arm across his throat. Once I accomplish this, I create space between our bodies by pushing off my feet, elevating my hips, and pushing him upward using my arms. Keeping him elevated with my arms, I drop my back to the mat. Using the space I just created, I pummel my right arm under his left arm and establish an underhook. At the same time, I escape out to the side and come up to my knees. Establishing a seatbelt around his waist using my right arm, I am now in a position to strike him with my left hand. I have escaped side control. I drive my right arm into my opponent's neck, elevate his body, establish an underhook, and escape out from underneath him. I drive my arm across my opponent's throat, push off, make space, establish an underhook, and move around to take my opponent's back. One more time. He holds me, I get my arm across his throat, elevate him, and escape to a position where I can strike. Here my opponent establishes side control and drops his weight down to keep me pinned. No problem, you can still execute this technique. Now I demonstrate how to escape the bottom mount position. It is a simple technique, but it is very important that you drill it over and over. So I start by placing my right arm across my opponent's hips and pushing him away to create space. This allows me to place my left elbow to the inside of his right leg and elevate it. With his body forced away and his right leg elevated, I slide my left knee underneath his right leg. Then, I force his right leg away using my left leg and establish the half guard. One more time. My left elbow enters here and I push him away. At the same time, I put my left leg out and place it against the inside of his leg. He is balanced on top of me, so I put my elbow in, lift, and get my knee to the inside. One more time faster.
Mais rápido. Segura. Vamos mostrar agora.
Now I show an escape for when your opponent attains the back position. The first thing you must do in this position is defend your neck. So I obtain control of the arm my opponent has wrapped around my neck with his left hand. If your opponent manages to wrap his arm all the way around your neck, then you want to pull his arm away. If your opponent is controlling your neck like this, then you need to pull his arm away from your neck. So I control his hand here, lean back, and use my right hand to pull his right hook off of my leg. Once I remove his hook, then I sit down on top of his leg to prevent him from reestablishing it. Next, I turn into my opponent and establish top control. With my opponent attacking my neck, I have to defend against the choke. That is my primary goal. Next, I remove his hook, sit on top of his leg, and then turn and establish the top position. One more time, normal speed. My opponent attacks my neck, I defend against the choke, and remove his hook. Next, I sit on top of his leg, turn, and establish the top position. Notice how I drive my leg flat in this angle. This helps to pop off his inside leg hook.
Vai, pegou.
Now I show how to escape when you're in your opponent's guard and he locks in a triangle choke. What I don't want is to allow my opponent to move my right arm towards my left side because it allows him to lock in the choke tight. So when he applies a triangle, my first goal is to keep my right hand on his stomach. If you let your opponent cross your arm, it will be difficult to bring it back, so don't let it happen. With my right hand on his stomach, I maintain my base, look up, and push my right hand into his stomach. Look up and push on his stomach. If you lower your head, it allows him to lock the choke tight. So, once he gets the triangle, I look up and break his legs apart. To finish, I move my left arm in front of his right leg. Again, I show the defense for the triangle choke. First, I don't let my opponent cross my right arm to the left side of my body. If I allow him to do this, I'll be trapped and it will be very difficult to escape. So I place my right hand on his stomach, look up, posture, and break his legs apart. One more time. He gets the triangle, and I cannot allow him to lower my head, so I look up, push on his stomach, and break his legs apart. One more time. This is another way to escape the triangle choke when you're in your opponent's guard. In this situation, he has control of your head, which prevents you from looking up and posturing. To prevent my opponent from locking in the submission, I climb to my feet, step my right leg over his chest, and then drop back, breaking his legs apart. My opponent locks in the triangle. First, I prevent him from moving my right arm towards my left side. Next, I stand up. Notice how I'm grabbing my right hand with my left hand to prevent him from pushing my right arm to my left side. Finally, I step my right leg over his chest and drop back, breaking his legs apart. One more time. My opponent attacks with a triangle and controls my head. To escape, I stand up, step over his chest, and drop back. This is far too much leverage here for my opponent to maintain the triangle with the strength of his legs alone. The reason I step over his chest is to keep his back flat to the mat, allowing my upper body to pry his legs apart. Without this step, he may very likely follow you backwards and finish the triangle from the mount. Now I show a simple defense for when you're in your opponent's guard and he applies an arm lock. First off, it is very important to pay attention to your arm. When you do this, you can prevent your opponent from attacking your arm in the first place. For example, if I posture up and leave my arms lying across my opponent's body, he can attack them. To make it more difficult, I posture up with my hands down by his hips. However, even when you pay attention to your arms, you can still get caught. Here my opponent goes for the arm lock. The first thing I do is drive my weight into him to stack his body and wrap my free arm around the back of his head. This prevents him from straightening his legs and finishing the submission, and makes it less risky to pull my trapped arm free. Once I escape, I take advantage by spinning around my opponent's legs and establishing the side control position. One more time. I wrap my free arm around my opponent's head, drive my weight into him, and pull my arm out. Once accomplished, I pass into side control. One more time. He attacks with the arm lock, I wrap my free arm around his head, pull my trapped arm out, and pass. The trick here is to keep my opponent stacked. If I allow him to spin underneath me or force my head away from his, he will likely finish this armbar. He may also attempt to switch to a triangle as I rip out, but if you keep him stacked head to head, he will be past his legs before he can secure the choke. Now I demonstrate how to defend against the guillotine choke when you're in your opponent's guard. First off, you need to think about protecting your neck before attempting to escape. You do not want to hit him. You must defend your neck or you will pass out. So my opponent wraps his right arm around my neck, and I defend against the choke by grabbing his right wrist with my left hand and laying down with him. Next, I wrap my right arm underneath his head. If he is stubborn and continues to hold on to my head, then I post on my left leg, drive my right shoulder down into his face, and pull his right arm away from my neck using my left hand. One more time. He gets the guillotine and I defend my neck. I wrap my arm around his head, place my weight on his face, and pull his arm away from my neck. For Shinzo to finish this guillotine, he needs my hips and my head on the right side of his belly button, all on one side of his midline. So you can see here by driving my shoulder into his neck, walking my hips to the right, and driving them into the ground, I make this impossible. From here, I posture up. My opponent attacks my neck. I grab his hand, wrap my right arm around his head, pull his arm away from my neck, and posture. Now faster.